So this is my title. I'll try and explain it a little bit, but I think actually Sian's largely sort of discussed or introduced the principles that I wanted to do, which is basically to let things go. But I thought I'd start off. I'm going to talk quite quickly because through the first part, trying to maybe speed up a bit of time. When I was a student, my first year, we had a tutor called Eric Gibson, who was a painter at the College of Printing. And he said something to us all one day early on in the first year, which completely threw me. Basically what he said was, there's no point making a piece of work unless you have something to say, unless you know what it is that you want to say. And I was an 18 or 19-year-old young man, and I sort of went away and thought very hard about this, and I thought, I can't think of anything that I want to say. What on earth do I want to say? And I was actually mildly traumatized. I think I still am by this comic. And the other thing about this sort of idea of what have you got to say is in a sense, well, why what you've got to say the least bit interest to anybody else? I think this is a problem that a lot of artists have, and also a lot of photographers who, perhaps like Ron, would work for and I worked for a long time over a piece of work before actually showing it to anybody. And how do you know whatever it is that you're working on really is of any interest to one at all? So one works blind in a sense. And when I was coming to prepare this talk again, I thought, well, what on earth is it I want to say? It makes some sense. David asked me to contribute to the talk on narrative. It made some sense in the sense because narrative is so embedded in my work to contribute that. But then I thought, well, I've already spoken to most of you 2 or 3 times already this year. Can I possibly think of anything new to say? And I've been mulling this over, and when one gives a talk like this, one's frequently sort of drawn on to what it is that's preoccupying you one at a particular time. And I've reached a certain age now where I'm beginning to look back quite a lot and think about things that I've done. And there's an aspect of that in this talk. But just at the end of last term, I went off to America, and I had a small trip to America, and I was having dinner with a friend of mine called Philippe Lamont, who runs an extraordinary lab in New York, huge sort of lab, where it's 2 buildings really now, photography lab, where he basically just works with artists. And you can go there, and you can one day you'll meet Paul Graham, and another day Serrano will be there. He used to work with Abden and great litany of wonderful photographers. And Philippe was in a rather morose mood because he was a great friend of Saul Leiter, New York photographer, who took these first few pictures I'm going to show. Saul Leiter died a year ago, and Philippe was preparing himself to give a talk at Memorial, which was about 3 days following the talk. And he was telling me this story about how he and Saul used to sort of meet up, and Philippe would spend a lot of time during these conversations expressing the existential angst that he feels about his life and his work. He employs 55 people. He's invested millions and millions of pounds in this business. He's 70 years old, and he's trying to sort of keep the whole thing going, and he's weary and he's tired. And he said one time Saul leaned over to him and said, "Philippe, have you ever tried doing nothing?" And that sort of gave me the idea for sort of partly the title. The Sol LeWitt, in a sense, was somebody who was remarkably casual and photographer in a way, who spent 60 years living in the Lower East Side of New York, working. He worked commercially for a bit. He was a fashion photographer. He was sort of part of a school called the New York School, which involved photographers like Bruce Davidson and Frank and Weegee and Helen Levitt and Abden and so on, who were living and working in New York as young photographers around this time, the late 40s, early to mid 50s. Sol would go out, and he went out for 50, 60 years with a camera and just take these incredibly casual but wonderful, quiet, gentle, warm pictures of the streets of New York. This is a small quote from Sol's, which says something about the fact that he is not as well known as he perhaps might be. He was the son of a rabbi, a Talmud scholar, somebody who himself was trained up to become a rabbi and then sort of abandoned it all and went to New York and lived and worked as an artist. And so that's one of the reasons I'm just starting off with looking at these pictures of Sol LeWitt, who almost did nothing, just went out and strolled and looked and made this pictures. One of the reasons why I suppose we don't know that much about him is that what he lacked, and he sort of says in that quote there, was this sort of energy, this drive, this motivation to actually fashion something from the work. something that I think all of the people that be talking today have. We have something within us which is a drive. Yes, we're fascinated by photography. We love making pictures. We basically go out with cameras, as Ron was suggesting, and basically use them to point at the world. But then we want to somehow or other bring things together, to fashion, to organise, to cohere a broader and wider sort of statement with our pictures. But another point that I wanted to make, that I've been thinking about this notion of narrative, a very simple one, is that idea of narrative which is to do with the photographer's whole life, to do in a sense with the voice, with the sound, with the cadence. What it is that in a sense makes one sort of distinct. This notion of I've made this project and I've made this project is all very well, but actually where is this work coming from, and how is it being drawn out, and what is your voice? What are you saying? And a second point about this notion of narrative is that these pictures look effortless. That's something we all in a sense aspire to, the sense to sort of strive, but not to show that we're striving. And one of the strengths of Saul Lewitt's work Saul Leiter's work, is that he was a painter as well, and he painted and painted and painted. And in a sense, this sense of the relentless drive to sort of make work and make images, and to somehow or other give them a feeling of, one's doing nothing, which is going out and pressing the shutter. I thought that was sort of Sean's point about pressing the shutter. Well, yeah, a little bit more going on than that. The quote that this phrase of Saul Leiter set off brought me back to this book here, or this story here. This is a story by J.B. Priestley, which I read when I was a very young man, which had a big influence on me, called On Doing Nothing. And in this story, Priestley recounts how, when he was a young man, it's written in about the middle to late 1930s, when he was a young man, he went with a group of friends up to Yorkshire on a train from London. And they stayed in a farmhouse, and every day they walked up onto the moor with a few sandwiches and a thermos of coffee given them by the farmer's wife where they were staying. And they went up onto the moor and they lay down on the grass, or lay down on the heather, and they stared up at the sky, and they spent the whole day just lying down, staring up at the sky, listening to the skylarks, smoking pipes, having the odd conversation. And in the story, he talks about how when they came back down, the restorative act of the quiet contemplation of nature had fed them all in a very rich way. And he talks about how one of the problems in the modern world is this sort of sense of how the urgency of striving can get in the way, really, of quiet and intelligent thought. And right at the end of the essay, he sort of surmises, he said, what would have happened had all the people who gathered round at who drew up the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War, and have made such a botch of things, because here was he looking at the imminent sort of Second World War, which was clearly going to happen. What would have happened if all of them had basically been taken out and taken up into the mountains and somewhere or other, and just made to stare at the sky for a week? And would they then, when they got back down round the table, have come up with such a botched sort of treating? And so that sense of doing as little as possible, of restorative. And I've just shown a few pictures here of the skies we've seen: Constable and Stieglitz and Eggleston and Paul Graham, all of whom, in a sense, searching for something, to articulate something kind of particular, but through the act of minimally confronting nothing. So a third strand of thinking around this talk, setting up this notion of doing very little or doing nothing, comes from my fascination with Gilbert White, who was born in the village of Selborne in Hampshire in the 1720s, and he lived until the 1790s. He went to Oxford and came back to the village and became the village vicar. Spent the rest of his life there, rarely leaving it. But he contributed enormously to the understanding of the natural world that we now have, through the keeping of what he called, first of all, his garden calendar, which then became a naturalist's journal. And Gilbert White basically started off by tending his small garden, And he was somebody who went out into the world and looked and observed and asked questions, and asked very simple questions. But he used that process to build up a profound and complex understanding of the world around him. Here he is, in his rather formal attire as a vicar. He was, for instance, particularly interested in the hirundines, the swallows and house martins of the world, and he was one of those, early on, who was baffled by the fact that they suddenly sort of disappeared come the end of August. Where did they all go? No one knew what happened to what we now know as sort of migratory sort of species of birds. These things appeared sometime in sort of April, and they disappeared sometime in August, and nobody had any idea where they went. One of the suspicions was that they all dived down into ponds and buried themselves in the mud of ponds. And so to sort of discern whether or not that was the case, he had several ponds dug out to see if anybody could find where the birds were. There was another theory that they hid in the eaves of houses or into the thatch of houses. So when an old lady died in the village, he got hold of the house. He got a couple of men, and they took the entire thatch off to see if they could find any of the birds. And he began to surmise the early notions of the fact that these things might come and go and leave and fly. So I'm sort of introducing him really because for me he's been a sort of a foundation figure in terms of this idea of just being in one place, going out into the world, walking, looking, thinking, and making observations, and trying to sort of frame a bigger understanding of the world through that act. And one of the things that Gilbert White did, one of the things he contributed, this is a picture of a volcanic eruption. It's actually from Chile. But I'm using it because in late 1783, early 1784, the clouds of the air of northern Europe, talking about looking up into the skies again, were coloured by great clouds of red and coloured dust, which had, this is from his diary and from his journal, which had a catastrophic kind of impact on all sorts of situations. Crops started growing, people were starving, rain patterns, climate patterns shifted, and nobody knew why. Where did this sort of stuff come from? Why was the sky a different colour? What was behind it? And he again was one of the early people who began to make connections between the news that eventually came through of an Icelandic volcano called Laki, I think it is, Stephen would know, which exploded and blew up an enormous amount of dirt and dust into the atmosphere across 1783, 1784, and for 2 or 3 years revolved around the atmosphere of the Northern Hemisphere. Some people think it led to the French Revolution because the starving French peasants got fed up looking at the richness of Louis whatever. So here was this person doing absolutely nothing but pottering around in the small area of the village of Selborne, but making his observations and connecting out. So however much one is dealing with the local in a sense, the world comes into the story. So I wanted to sort of set those 3 things up as a sort of a formal introduction to this notion of doing nothing or doing as little as possible. And now I'm going to talk about some of my work, and this is where I again get a little bit nervous because goodness knows how many times you've all looked at these pictures. But I want to talk a little bit about how I actually formulate and make a piece of work. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the painter's pool. This is the first picture I made. This was made in February 2002. The pool is in a wood near where I live. It's called Stoke Woods. It's about 2 or 3 miles outside the city of Exeter. The pool was dug and looked after by a painter called Mike Garton, who was a colleague of ours at the Art College through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It formed at a point, or he formed it at a point where a tree that had been blown over during the Great Gale had partly blocked a stream, and he set out to sort of dig out and create this pool out of it. And he managed the pool and was still looking after it in 2002 when I took this picture. So Ron talked about the idea of work starting and work ending, and that's exactly how things work for me. So I start off with this one picture. I took this picture and I've got absolutely no idea what is going to subsequently happen, whether or not even I'm going to take another photograph, and if I do, what will happen. But in this original picture, when I look back on it now, and I can sort of formulate this, but I wasn't really that consciously aware of it at the time, are embedded, we have a site, a place, we have a protagonist, we have the artist. You can see his easel here. There's his easel. There's a piece of string going across there. There's a pole in the top of the tree. So he, as the protagonist, is embedded in this place. But the place is a protagonist as well, the actual site. It's a live, dynamic site. I'm a protagonist. I'm a sort of there, part of the sort of the storytelling, the act of being there. One becomes a protagonist in one's own work. Weather and light are protagonists. The very particular position of the pond, the angle of the valley that leads down to it, which led east-west, determines partly how light and so on affect the place. So light is a protagonist. So we have once this picture, in a sense, sets up a situation and a set of protagonists. And all I do is go back and see what unravels. So this series lasted just over 2 years, and one of the things that rather shockingly happened almost immediately after I took the first picture was that Mike Garton retired, and on the day he retired, he discovered he had a huge cancerous tumour in his brain, in his head. And basically, he spent 2 years dying while I was making these pictures. And still painting. He was still visiting the area and painting between bouts of time in hospital. So you can again see in this picture here, this is another view. So part of the narrative, again, that's sort of embedded in a piece of the work like this, and Ron again was, the word I thought he used was a very good one, one's wrestling with a series of situations, trying to sort of wrestle out each picture and wrestle out how they begin to form a narrative. And again, for the last 10 or 15 years, every time I make a piece of work, these are taken on a 10-8 camera, and I make contact prints about this beam. And one of the rather wonderful things about working like that is that the plate size and the print size is a rather neat size to move directly into the pages of a book. So like Ron, I fundamentally think about works now when I'm making them as book works, and subsequently, whether or not they're shown, that's another matter. So each picture is, in a sense, wrestled out and begins to sort of contribute something to the sort of developing kind of narrative. I shot, I think, about 45 or 60 negatives over 2 years, and the final work constitutes 32 pictures, so it's a pretty unusual sort of strike rate, really. The pond is always sort of featured in the picture. So every picture is made pointing towards the pond. I tried making a few pictures where I moved the camera around. When I spoke to Mike about what he was trying to do, he spent 25, 26 years painting in this wood. Every day of the year, for 25 years, Christmas Day, whatever, he would go to the wood and paint. Completely obsessive man. And when you spoke to him about what he was trying to do with his paintings, one of the things that he said he was trying to do was to work out what the hell an artist does when they're standing in the middle of an extraordinarily complex space. You can imagine, being surrounded by the canopy of a wood with a piece of paper and a pencil. How on earth do you begin to make a mark that sort of sets off in train, making an image that's built of a response to the extraordinary complexity of a place? And I thought it would be rather interesting to try and think about that problem in relation to the way that one might work with a camera. And one of the bizarre things that happened was that when I turned the camera away from looking at the pond directly, I could orchestrate perfectly pleasant pictures, you know, the actual tangle of whatever looked quite aesthetically pleasing, and I was quite pleased with them as pictures. But for some reason, when I put them into the series, they had absolutely no meaning and no place within the series. So there's something about this sense of focus and looking and pointing that was very important. Another active narrative, I suppose, that's embedded in these pictures in particular, for me, is the act of making work. David alluded to that at the beginning, this notion of a photographer going out with a 35mm camera and approaching a situation and making a series of images and sort of working towards the sort of the final decisive moment if it was Cartier-Bresson. But these pictures are very different. Because it was a wood, because I was photographing at a particular time of day, usually quite early in the morning, and that gets back to this point of you know, this work embedded in a wider narrative. Because I was photographed early in the morning because it's about 10 miles from the sea, and one has the air temperature inversion, and just after sort of dawn, the wind settled very, very sort of quietly, whatever was happening, because if there was a wind blowing off the sea and the temperature of the land started sort of moving up, there would be a moment of a period of about 20 minutes when there was a particular calm in this area, and I didn't want a lot of movement. And each one of these pictures, because they're quite early, are there 2, 3, 4, sometimes 20-minute exposures. So I would put the camera up on the tripod, climb up onto the top of the ladder, which I was using, set everything up, press the cable release, and sometimes just stand there and watch for 5 minutes, which was a wonderful experience because you just thought about how time in this experience was sort of in a sense embedding itself in a single image, and sometimes go for a walk and just come back 10 minutes later and close the shutter down. So this idea of what's actually embedded in a still picture has sort of grown out of the making of these pictures. This is, I've edited them down slightly. This is January 2004, so we're just under 2 years in. And this is the last picture that I made, which was about June, April. And Mike died in May 2004. And though I went back for some reason or other, I just never made another picture. That was the end of the series. So his death inadvertently brought the piece of work to closure. I tried to maintain it upon myself for a few months afterwards, but it was too much work. And so these narratives sort of set in train and run alongside one another. And for me, as I was making the work, it became a kind of allegorical piece about his life, the life of an artist, striving to sort of build and create a universe around themselves, and to try and sort of form their presence on Earth, but gradually losing, like all of us eventually, the means to do that, and giving up and allowing oneself to be, in a sense, absorbed back into the Earth. So gradually through this series, signs of his presence fall away, and in fact all of his stuff is still embedded in this place. His easel and the poles and some of his pictures, I think, are still left in the wood. So that was the making of that. This talk does hop around a bit. I hope it's not too chaotic. Slumps, creeps, slides and flows. I've long been preoccupied by the processes that make the world what it is. One of the most powerful photographic experiences I've had, and lessons that I've had, was looking at the second view book that Mark Klett and his colleagues created, where they re-photographed a series of these 19th century early topographic photographs. So this is a photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan. I don't know the exact date, but it would be somewhere around the late 1860s, early 1870s. And Mark Klett and his team went back, they found these pictures, they went back to the site of about 100 of them, worked out exactly where the photographs had been made, worked out exactly what time of year, what time of day the pictures had been made, focal length lenses and so on, and remade pictures. And one of these, unfortunately not this one, I can't find the actual one, but one of these series really, really struck me as something quite profound. And what fascinated me was not all this sort of infrastructure here, but the hillsides opposite. And when I looked at, so this is the sort of the second view picture, taken many years later, 100 years later or so. What struck my imagination was that if we looked at these two hillsides, they're still covered with these same sort of shrubs, same stones, same flora and fauna. Tiny kind of changes in 100, 110 years. And that what had actually gone on there that had sort of formulated those changes. And rather than sort of epic movements, what had gone on is something that would be the result of millions and billions of tiny kind of narrative shifts. So one day a breeze of wind might blow a seed off a tree and push it sort of a metre down onto the ground, and if a drop of rain happened to fall on that one seed, it might germinate, and if the seed could then embed itself into soil, a bush might come up, and then maybe another 20 or 30 years later another seed from that tree. And this sense of how the world becomes. Photographers talk about the idea of and geographers do as well, of landscapes are always becoming. There's always this sense of sort of movement and flow and transition. And the act of the still photograph within that sense of a flow is something that has underpinned all a lot of the work that I've made over the last sort of 20 or so years. And geographers have this rather wonderful term called creep, which is the sort of creep geography, is to do with the study of the movement of tiny particles. So rather than the sort of epic shifts of rockfalls, it's to do with that. And the body of work that I made, well, subsequently I'm going to jump over these because of time, so I'm not going to talk about my rockfall pictures today, I don't think. But the body of work that I made, partly as a result of that, wasn't as a result of that, but I was thinking about that, was a piece of work called The Raft of Carrots. And these pictures were made between about 1987, 1988, and 1988, 1992, and were shown at the Photographer's Gallery the first time I ever worked with David. And they became a book. We showed them in an exhibition, but we also fashioned a book out of it. And this was the second time after the Red River where the making of a book was something that was embedded right the way through in terms of the making of the piece of work. So unlike Ron perhaps and others, Ron's early work, when I'm making a piece of work, when I'm making a book, from that first picture, I'm thinking about how the book is going to be structured. But it's a sort of an accretion process. So I take a picture and then I take another picture, and I'm thinking about, well, how do those two pictures possibly kind of relate to one another? What are the sort of links? How can I begin to use the format of the making of a book to bring them together? And then I take a third and then a fourth and then hundreds, and continually in my imagination. So I create the books in my mind whilst I'm making a piece of work, and every time I expose a negative, I'm wondering and asking myself, how does that picture actually possibly, how can I use that in relation to the overall series of pictures? So The Raft of Carrots starts with, I haven't got many slides of it here, it starts with 5 pictures, a bit like the Big Creek line book, but rather sort of a more subdued body of water. There's a series of pictures of the flow, the turbulent flow across the surface of running streams, most of them coming off Dartmoor, but not exclusively. And in a sense, I use that to set up the notion of sort of turbulence, the idea of sort of continual chaotic turbulence, the idea of movement. So we go back to those two landscapes of O'Sullivan and Klett, and try and sort of imagine almost landscapes becoming themselves through almost the flow of time. If one could sort of speed up, time-lapse a landscape over 120 years, and just imagine landscapes as flowing spaces. The pictures that begin The Raft of Carrots are a kind of metaphoric introduction to this notion of turbulence, and psychologically how we deal with notions of living in a turbulent world where certainty is This is where the Rockfall pictures come into it. Certainty is continually undermined by the sort of shifting and sometimes radical transitions of the world, both socially, culturally, but physically, that we live in. And this picture is a sort of photograph that comes at the end of that series, and it acts as a link between the pictures that come subsequently, because this picture is a place where that turbulence has finally ceased. What you have is a scar or a mark that's been drawn across the surface of the water by somebody pulling a stick or something. So there's tiny, tiny human action that's sort of led to the making of this image. And all of the pictures in the Raft of Carrots, they're all quite individual, so they're not in any sense made. This is a piece of work where, apart from the first series, these pictures are not made in a sort of sequential, they're not intended to work in a sequential way. Each picture is a narrative in its own right. It's a narrative that contains a lot of uncertainty, and going back to this idea of creep, they're tiny, tiny, tiny events. These are human events where we have interacted in the world, or someone has, in the smallest possible way. So here somebody, I presume it was a farmer, has collected some carrots, stuck them on, made a raft of wood, and tied it to the bank of a river. So one comes across their encounters with these weird, strange sort of sites of evidence of some very small human preoccupation, but a place where our interaction with the natural world is very much sort of present. So I was thinking, when I was making this work, about the idea of dominion, this notion that early in Genesis, we create this argument that God has somehow or other given us the power of dominion to sort of care for and marshal the flora and the fauna and the resources of the world. And how are we dealing with that? How are we taking on that responsibility and dealing with that? Sometimes quite negatively, because these, I believe, I don't know, are poison carrots to kill the koiku and rats that are living on the riverbanks that the farmer wants to get rid of. And sometimes, like this one, a somewhat over-exuberant response to feeding birds. So on this bird table in Teignmouth, not only is the bread there's actually a piece of steak, there's a piece of fruit cake, there are these grapes, almost like a Caravaggio still life, that's sort of laid out by an old lady who used to live just next to here and feed the birds every day. Or an object like this, which is a railway sleeper that's been dumped into the Exe River. So very kind of casual sort of throwing away of something. But on it live all these tiny, tiny little shells. What are they called? Things in shells. Oh, come on. Sorry, my brain's gone. Snails. Sorry, brain's gone. So on it live all these tiny snails. And for me, Ron was talking about I thought really, really fascinatingly, about this idea of imposing metaphor into a piece of work. This work is very metaphoric, but again, one has to be, I think, careful. So for me, when I looked at this photograph and saw more clearly how these snails are holding on, this sense of metaphorically how we cling to sort of security, and within the context of this turbulent sort of world that we live in, was coming through in this picture. This is a hybrid picture, which actually comes up. The next two pictures actually come out of the Red River, but I didn't use them in the Red River, and they sort of fed into. This one's never been. I've never shown this picture or used it, but it somehow or other fits within the series of the Raft of Carrots. So a series of puzzling, tiny narrative interventions, all brought together within a book, and accompanied. We talked about writing earlier. Within the context of this book, I decided to write my first sort of attempt to write some short stories, which run alongside the pictures. They work in a completely different way, but again, stories and narratives about uncertainty, clinging on, holding on, surviving, that grew out of my meetings with people while I was making the work. I've lost the plot here. I can't remember why I put these in. These are from a commission that I did in Tate St Ives a few years ago. I suppose I put them in partly because I'm thinking a lot at the moment about how to break out of the pattern of work of ways of working that I've established for myself. This idea of finding a site, discovering a set of protagonists, going back and letting the sort of the situation, the unravelling of whatever happens to build a piece of work. And I'm trying to make smaller pieces of work. So this is one of the first successful examples of that. So this is a site that I photographed. I don't remember why I put this in there. In the China Clay area of St Austell. I shot about 8 or 10 negatives, and really loved this particular view. Was fascinated by the view and the dynamics of what was going on. This is over about 5 or 6 months, the continual movement of human activity and light as well around this particular site. And a friend of mine, Peter Fraser, was suggesting that when I hung the work at Tate St Ives, why didn't I just sort of hang these about 8 pictures, this series, which I didn't have the nerve to do, unfortunately. Might have been an interesting experiment. But they lead up to this picture, and so this introduces another idea of narrative. I suppose what I'm trying to do today is to just to sort of unpick something of the, unravel something of the complexity of narratives that I see embedded in my work when I look back. This isn't intentional. But this is a picture that David Chandler introduced me to. It's in Manchester City Library, dates from 1857. And what this picture does so remarkably for me, it in a sense sums up one of the underlying narratives or preoccupations of a lifetime of my work, which is the collision in our sort of collective imagination between the story of the pastoral tradition that comes down to us through Greek and Roman sort of myth, with the narrative of the industrialization of the world. The sort of collision of these two. And if we go back and look at the painter's pool, one thing I forgot to tell you about that thing, it's an ancient piece of ancient woodland. It's denoted as a piece of ancient woodland, which means that it's been managed or left as such for at least 1,000 years. And yet, I discovered whilst I was sort of making the work, I went for a walk with a man from the Forestry Commission. We walked through it, and we were walking through it together, and he said, "This is extraordinary. I've never seen a piece of woodland like this in Devon." And I said, "What is it about it?" And he said, "Well, this woodland, the one that we looked at a while ago, was almost completely chopped down during the First World War. So during the First World War, during the first industrial sort of war of our age, this ancient woodland was almost completely decimated, and the wood was taken, and no doubt trenches were built somewhere in France from the wood that was taken from that wood, and they left a tree every 100 or so yards to regenerate." And so this idea of how even in that sort of wonderful space, the industrialization of war and so on is somehow another quietly embedded narrative, rather fascinates me. And the Red River, which I'm not really going to talk about sort of very much, but only to introduce an ultimate body of work, was very much a series of pictures that came from exploring the current ramifications during the 1980s when this work was made of the collision between these two narratives, the pastoral rural world and the industrial world, because this is a valley that's been exploited for 200 or 300 years for the mining and extraction of tin. So the bringing together of these two sort of meta-narratives, in a sense, within a very particular place a particular set of conditions and particular culture, particular society was something that was embedded in this work. And as I've spoken before already a couple of months ago, so I won't go on too much, the idea about how these sorts of narratives, what I call mythic narratives, I find we all carry them around, the sort of the stories that our society, our culture, our families, tell us as we're growing up, that embed an understanding of the world in our imaginations, are live with us continuously and are passed down through sort of generations. So here we have a picture that sort of, in a sense, summons up something of the state of the early industrial revolution within the rural Britain. Or in this narrative, the story of the traveller travelling through the forest or the woodland on their own, seeing the small lit up building in the distance and being drawn at night towards the lit window. Or in this picture, the potency of the narrative of what a farm is, articulated by children who lived 50 yards away from where this farm was made in a Methodist chapel in Cornwall, in a farm that couldn't be further away from the rather beautiful, exquisite image that they've created here, a farm full of howling, yowling dogs, black mud, dampness, dankness, ruined and rotten architectural farm machinery, and so on. And the potency of these sort of mythic narratives within our imagination is something that I've long been fascinated with, and within the body of this work came out for me in its most sort of interesting and sort of satisfactory form. So the Pond at Upton Pine is another pond piece, began in 1996, and again this process of unravelling, this is the first picture, and so we set out with a site. The site has a history, and so part of the making of the work is the gradual understanding of that history. And if I summarise it briefly for you now, because it's very important to the making of the work, this is a piece of land that's been owned for 800 years by a series of aristocratic families who had intermarried and passed it all the way down. It was ceded to them originally by Henry I in about 1100. So we're looking at a piece of landscape which embeds the notion of aristocratic ownership and control and patronage. We're looking at a place, though, that in the late 18th century was developed as a mine, because there was a seam of manganese that was found just at the back where the back of the pond is, and was mined for about sort of 30 or 40 years. So the Industrial Revolution, agricultural sort of life goes on for 700 or 800 years here. Then the Industrial Revolution comes along. The mine is dug, the mine's abandoned by about 1820s, 1824. Gradually the pond fills in, no one wants to do with it. The landowner, who's sitting on 5,000 or 10,000 acres around this, can't really be bothered to do anything with this pond. It becomes an eyesore in the middle of a village. It's a village dump, it's polluted, it's poisoned, it's chemically sort of, pretty messy. None of that I knew when I took this first picture. So the unravelling of the history of the site becomes part of the work. But when I took the second picture, another strand of narrative appears, and that is that, again, I just went back to take another picture, and I had no idea what this was going to grow into. I met a guy who was beginning to clear the duckweed from the surface of the pond. You could see a pile of it there. And he asked me what I was doing, and I told him that I was taking a picture. I was using a 10-8 camera, so he didn't recognise what it was. And I asked him what he was doing, and he said that he lived next door, and with the permission of the landowner, he was going to transform this site into something kind of very different and quite beautiful. And I asked him what his vision was, and he described to me an Arcadian sort of dream vision of turning this place into a setting for his family, where boughs of trees would in little paths would lead one round the pond, where glades of light would sort of allow bluebells and other wildflowers to kind of emerge, where seats would be built to watch the rising and the setting of the sun, where his daughter's pony could be kept and corralled, where the ducks and chickens could feed. And So that narrative then becomes a protagonist. He becomes a protagonist. He's carrying that dream with him. He sets about to transform the pond. I set about to tell the story of that process. Something interesting then happened. This is the third picture that I took about sort of 2 or 3 months in. And I immediately sort of became very disappointed by what he was doing to the pond, because he was clearing this duckweed. And one of the things that had fascinated me most about the picture opportunities at the beginning were the way that this green spread of weed delineated a graphic space in the middle of the picture, and the idea of him taking it all of the way. I remember thinking when I took this picture, well, actually, shall I bother to carry on? So the narrative, the way that one is engages in the process of formulating the work is really important. This is part of a diptych made in December 1996. And he's begun here to build a pier for his boat, because he wanted to row his little boat around the pond to manage his island and manage the pond. The site was an absolute dump. As you can see, the farmers throwing lots of rubbish in here. And it quickly became, a number of things quickly became apparent. One was that the guy was slightly out of control. He didn't really quite know what he was doing. He was driven by this vision, but he wasn't really too sure about how to sort of implement it. He was just using his bare hands and toiling away. And at the same time, his neighbours and other people in the village were doing their best to undermine what he was doing. And I felt at times like I was in the middle of a George Eliot novel, that all of these protagonists were working away, and I was in somehow or other embedded in the middle of a mid-Victorian novel. And one of the things that I've tried making work where I actually tell a story, but it never works. Because one of the problems with photography, for me, is that one's dealing with what's there all the time. And so I have to sort of let go and just allow the act of revisiting and looking and thinking to lead the narrative on. One never knows at any stage what's going to happen next. I thought at one stage that maybe I ought to lend a hand to this guy. Perhaps something I could do was, but then I decided to sort of step back from that and to allow the process, his process of working to drive what happens. This is one of those pictures which I was talking about a little bit like those extended narratives in the Painter's Pool. This is one of my favourite pictures from this series, because I love that diagonal line that goes right the way through the pond. You see that little diagonal line that goes right the way through the pond. This is a 25-30 second exposure, and a duck paddled across the pond during the making of this picture and created that kind of photographic mark. So, that's the place itself, the narrative embedding itself in the pictures. Suddenly this sort of monstrous silo, almost sort of space-like silo, appeared next to the pond that became another part of it. And then something strange happened. After 3 years, I'd taken about 25 pictures. So this is a very, very slow process. I take 5, 6, 7 pictures a year. No planning, no organisation. I would just go back when I had a free moment, when I looked at the weather forecast, when I knew that the situation, the light was going to possibly avail me with the opportunity of making a picture. This is made in February 1993, so we're just under 3 years in. And at this stage he disappeared, the guy disappeared, and he never reappeared in the village. And so the piece of work had come to an end. There was nothing I could do really anymore about that. I was rather sad at the idea. I was hoping to make a more extended work, but this is the last picture that I made of his effort to transform the pond. And though he failed, and there's something of rather sort of the pathos of this, again, this for me was an allegorical work about how an everyman tried to make the world a better place, how all of us, in a sense, wish to leave the world a better place behind us. And there's something, the pathos of his failure, I think, is a very kind of human pathos. But what he did do was actually switch on the ecology of the pond, and there were kingfishers and various things flitting around at the time of making a picture like this. But then something extraordinary happened, for me anyway. A few months later, someone else began to work around the pond, and another villager from the village took on the task of transforming it with the agreement of the landowner. And I had a chat with him, and he was happy about me continuing. So I thought, oh, this is good. This opens up again. The story has a second chapter. And the next 3 years, I photographed the results of what he brought. And what was so fascinating for a landscape, someone interested in landscape perspective, was that he brought a completely different vision. And the vision that he brought was one that drives from the notion of improvement, improving land, which comes from an 18th century aristocratic notion of based on enclosure, taking over land, managing it better, fencing it, digging out rivers, making rivers grow better. The industrialization, the beginning of the industrialization of agricultural processes. And that's, in a sense, what drove him. So we see him here beginning to kind of fence off, to cut back. And if we look at these two pictures here, we get sort of evidence of his visions coming into play. So this was made March 2000, and this picture was made March 2001. One can see that he's sculpted the bank with a JCB, he's dug out the trees, he's taken away the paths, he's begun to fence further. The whole process of transformation has altered and is driven by a different narrative. Something else that's embedded in the work, as well as this sort of deep history of time going back 1,000 or so years, or even longer if one thinks about the geology that sets up the manganese mine, is the fact that I was dealing with the seasonal sort of variations. And so at one stage, I think in 2001, we had a great sort of year of winter floods, and so the whole thing sort of rose up about 5 or 6 feet higher. So within the work is embedded another set of sort of seasonal but social narratives as well. So this is this is one of the neighbours dumping all his garden waste into the pond. And this was the final picture, taken in 2002, May 2002, which again I went back but never made another picture. But in terms of thinking about this work, right from the beginning, it was going to be a book. Fairly simple sort of structure, but the 2 chapters made themselves sort of self-evident to me because of the 2 subsequent narratives. But in 1999, I took another photograph, this one, standing by the side of the pond and looking beyond it, down across the agricultural lands within which it was settled. So throughout the sort of the first sort of 30, 40 pictures of the book, one's living in a very, very tightly enclosed world of just looking at this pond again and not moving outside it. And these last few pictures act as a kind of codex to the series, suddenly step back and place the whole series into a wider context. And rather bizarrely, whilst I was, again, this was quite accidental, this small little puddle formed and continued through the next 2 or 3 years to have various manifestations. And it acts as a sort of a small mirror back to the bigger pond that we've been looking at over the last 30, 40 pictures. So I've rather rushed through that, but I hope that makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to give you a final few pictures. This is something I've been working at the moment. I talked a while ago in this talk about this idea of trying to break out of the pattern of making these large, extended pieces of work and trying to find simpler ways or other ways to make smaller works. And this is one of the ways that I'm exploring it at the moment. Last year, partly as a result of Ollie's showing me how to blog and so on, I started using Twitter, and I've been making pictures on my iPad for the last sort of 6 or 8 months and publishing them just after I make them. So I go out in the area of St James, which is where I live, in Exeter, go for a walk with the iPad, make some photographs, and then come back and publish them. And out of that has come another series of pictures, or another way of making pictures, which this comes from. So this is a series of pictures made over 5 days. So I'm trying to make work now a lot of the work that, one of the narratives that strands which I haven't been really picked up on very much is obviously to do with the processes of time, thinking sort of metaphysically about time and transformation and how that's embodied in understanding of the world shifting and moving. And so between the 14th and 18th of March, I made this little series of pictures. These are very much, some of the students have seen, not this series, but some of the other ones already. This is very much just work in its infancy, but it's just thinking about how to as one becomes an old man, make work about things that become more and more precious to you. So when I wake up in the morning, the most precious thing that I do every morning is think I'm here, there's a blackbird singing out in the garden. Every spring, I don't know how many more springs I'm going to watch. I want to make work about waking up and just experiencing the first few days of spring every year, so that's what this does. So I go out with my secateurs and lean over the walls of my neighbour's gardens and early in the morning and appropriate the bits and bobs that are hanging, and these are just a series of still lifes. And they're made over partly such a short period of time because of this very, very first early burst of spring, but also because we're having some building work done in our house at the moment. And there was just 4 days when the builders had plastered this wall and put up a glass ceiling in a sort of utility room conservatory. And I just grabbed the opportunity to make these pictures over these 4 days. And I'm going back to the theme. There is the ideas of books and of this sort of thing are beginning to. I've been planning a series of books like this for the past sort of few years, just making these very, very small studies of small groups of pictures. It's been rather garbled, but thanks for listening.